Good morning. It is good to be with you this morning. I ask, if you will, to be turning your Bibles to the book of Judges. We'll be looking there in just a moment. You see on the screen in front of you a series of questions about a kind of nation. And I ask the question is, can you imagine a nation where these things take place? A nation where false worship is adopted for the matters of personal convenience. I don't think we have to imagine too hard to think about people who worship for the purpose of their own convenience, who devise worship that satisfies their personal needs. Imagine that this same worship that someone originates is then adapted and spread to the masses. Imagine that the leaders of this worship have the mentality that they would rather worship or lead worship for many people instead of just a few. Imagine a nation where homosexuality is common, and I guess I should have added in this not just common, but approved and accepted as part of society. This next one may be a little harder to imagine, but an environment, a nation where cities engage in, or entire portions of a city engages in, violent sexual abuse. Not just as one or two, but as a group. And the leaders of that city refuse to enact any punishment upon those who engaged in such behavior. And obviously the question that we would ask is, how do people get this way? How do people end up with this kind of a mentality? How does a nation reach these depths? Well, you turn to Judges chapter 17. And all of these things are things that are contained in Judges chapter 17 through 21. And there is a phrase that occurs 4 times in Judges chapter 17 through 21 in which the writer records this statement: there was no king in Israel. Twice in those references, an additional statement is made that says everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And this is the nation as we see it in this period of the Judges. For the sake of time, we're not going to go into every detail that exists in this story, in these stories. I want us just to look, though, at some of these statements and put together some of the connection of what happened here. In chapter 17 and in verse 6 is one of our statements. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. As you'll see, and I think it's interesting, this section of Scripture is opened by this statement and then closed in chapter 21 and verse 25 with a similar statement. In this particular story, you have the story of Micah, who created an idol and set up worship in his home. And he felt very good about setting up one of his sons as the priest for this idol worship in his home. And it's interesting that if you look at the latter part of this chapter, beginning in verse 7, and we'll skip down to verse 10. Micah said to him, "Dwell with me," speaking to a Levite who had come his way. He says, "Dwell with me and be a father and a priest to me. I will give you 10 shekels of silver per year, a suit of clothes, and your sustenance." So the Levite went in. The Levite was content to dwell with the man, and the young man became like one of his sons to him. So Micah consecrated the Levite, and the young man became his priest, and lived in the house of Levi. Then Micah said, "Now I know that the Lord will be good to me, since I have a Levite as priest." Does this sound familiar in our society? You know, if we put the right stamp on something, it must be okay. Micah had gone and he had set up idol worship, which he had to know was contrary to the law of God. What's worse, you have a Levite who comes along who The priests and Levites were the keepers of the law and should have been the ones who should have stood up and said, idolatry is wrong. But instead of the Levites standing up and saying, this is wrong, we need to turn away from this, when offered money and a place to live, to be a priest, he said, sure, I'll do it. And Micah now says, well, hey, I've got a Levite, it must be okay. How many times today do you hear people take something that is contrary to the will of God and say, well, but you know what? There are churches that are Christian churches that say this is okay. How many times do you know people today take things that are contrary to the will of God, paste the name of Christ on them, and then somehow say, well, it must be okay because we're doing it in the name of Christ? Or because there are people who are trained in seminaries who say it's okay. We must feel good about it. But it's interesting, you come then over to chapter 18, and the Danites come along, and they find out what Micah has going on. And again, chapter 18 and verse 1 is another one of our statements. In those days, there was no king in Israel. And you come down, and you see that the Danites find out about what was going on in Micah's house. And look at verse 19. They speak to this Levite after they take him from Micah's home. And they said to him, be quiet, put your hand over your mouth, and come with us. Be a father and a priest to us. Is it better for you to be a priest to the household of one man, or that you be a priest to a tribe and a family of Israel? So here's a man who is already engaged in wrongdoing. He's already supporting idol worship for one family. The Danites come along, and instead of, here's an entire tribe, a group of a tribe, that instead of saying, hey, you know what, we see idolatry going on here. We need to put an end to this idolatry. Instead, they say, hey, you know, this guy's got a good thing going here. We'll take and we'll make him a priest for all of us. And the Levite is pleased by this, because now he's not just serving one, but he's serving an entire tribe. And there's an interesting statement in verses 30 and 31 of this chapter. The children of Dan set up for themselves the carved image. This is the carved image that they stole from Micah. And Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh, and his sons were priests of the tribe of Dan until the day of the captivity of the land. So they set up for themselves Micah's carved image, which he made all the time that the house of God was in Shiloh. It reminds a little bit of something we're going to talk about later, and that is Jeroboam, who set up idol worship. And that idol worship was never undermined. And here you have the same thing among the Danites. They come along and they set up this idol worship, and what does it do? It infects and has an impact on entire generations. Why? Because there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Chapter 19 and verse 1, again, we see this statement. It came to pass in those days, when there was no king in Israel, there was a certain Levite staying in the remote mountains of Ephraim. He took for himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judea. You read the rest of this story, and this is one of the most horrific stories contained in the Old Testament, in my opinion. It harkens back to the days of Sodom and Gomorrah. You'll recall that when the angels came to warn Lot of the impending doom, that the men of Sodom came and banged on the house of Lot. Said, we want those men. We want to know those men who came to your house. And Lot said, no, we won't do that. But I tell you what, I'll give you my daughters. You can have my daughters. I don't understand that. To this day, it's something I cannot explain, how Lot could offer that. But you see a similar thing here. This man's concubine goes off and has an affair. He goes and retrieves her. And in the process of time of trying to get back, he stops in Gibeah. And while there, he's brought into the house of a man. And while there, the inhabitants of Gibeah come and say, give us the man who came to you. We want to know him. And this isn't we want to go have coffee with him. This is they wanted to have a homosexual relationship with this man. And again, the response is, no, you can't have him, but I'll tell you what, we'll give you my virgin daughter and this man's concubine. So that's not what we want. They did eventually provide the Levite concubine. And these men raped and abused her all night long. The man gets ready to leave the next morning without seemingly any care for the woman. He says, come on, get up, it's time to go. And he realizes that she's dead. She has been abused so badly that she has died. And he goes home and he cuts her body up and he sends it throughout the tribes to just demonstrate how wicked these people are. The end result of all of this is the tribe of Benjamin is nearly eliminated from Israel. How does all of this come about? How does this kind of thing happen? Again, we come back to 21 and verse 25. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So what conclusions do we draw from this? And I'm sorry, but for some reason I am having a lot of trouble with this mic this morning. I apologize. What conclusions do we draw from this statement? There was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Well, let's take a look at some things. Was a king what God desired? Should we read this and say, well, if there had just been a king, things would have been different? We understand that the role of a king ought to be to set and enforce law. That's what a king ought to do. The idea seems to be that had there been a king, had there been someone to enforce laws, perhaps these things wouldn't have taken place. That instead of everyone doing what's right in their own eyes, they would have been punished, or these things would have been affected by a king. But is that what God's plan was? Turn over to 1 Samuel chapter 8. There is an interesting exchange that takes place in 1 Samuel chapter 8. Beginning in verse 4. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. Now I ask you this, is it true that Samuel's sons were wicked? Absolutely. But look at the next statement. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. So Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. According to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them out of Egypt, even to this day, which they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. Now therefore heed their voice. However, you shall solemnly forewarn them and show them the behavior of the king who will reign over them. When the people came to Samuel and said, we want a king, God didn't say, well, that's been my plan all along. What took you so long to ask? God said, Samuel, it's not you they've rejected. It's me they've rejected. They have rejected me as their king, as the one to rule over them. Had God desired for a king to be the means and intent of rule, he would establish that the day they entered the land. But he didn't. I want you to note something important here, and it's interesting, and that is that oftentimes it is the abuses or failures of men to carry out God's plan that lead men to reject God's plan. You'll see this in churches today. There are churches that don't want to have elders because they once had bad elders. And there are bad elders. And there are elders who can do severe damage to churches. I am thankful that the elders we have here are not of that classification. But that does not cause us to then say, well, we just abandon the concept of eldership. You see the challenges that arise among brethren sometimes, and God's government is each church takes care of itself. And there's problems that arise out of that. So people say, well, let's abandon that and let's go to a larger leadership. Let's go to a leadership that rules over multiple churches. There are things that happen in churches that shouldn't. There is a failure of leadership among men. That does not justify the rejection of the plan that God initially set forward. It's interesting because if you go back to the book of Deuteronomy, in chapter 17, God saw this day coming. He knew it would come. Even though it was not what he had planned or intended for his people, he knew exactly what the people would do. He says, beginning in verse 14 of Deuteronomy chapter 17, when you come to the land which the Lord your God is giving you and possess it and dwell in it and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. How familiar does that sound? Isn't that exactly what the people said? How many times do our false doctrines and our false concepts start that way? Well, hey, it's working for them, or we want to be like them. Isn't it interesting how throughout the Bible, God's people are never supposed to be like everybody else? And it's when we start trying to be like everybody else that we start having problems? I digress. Verse 15, you shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among your brethren. You shall set as a king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you who is not your brother. But he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. Nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. Also it shall be, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write for himself a copy of this law in a book, from the one before the priests and Levites. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, and be careful to observe all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brethren, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right hand or to the left, and that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. God said, I know a day's coming when you're going to want a king. You need to make sure that king adheres to my law. That's what's most important. What's most important is adhering to his law. Let's ask the question, was a king the answer? They did get their king. But before we look at the kings that they got, I want to go back a step. And I want to look at a generation that is discussed before all of this takes place. I want to look at the generation of Joshua. There's a powerful statement that's made in Judges 2 and verse 7. It's also made at the end of the book of Joshua. But I think it's interesting that it's included in the book of Judges as this particular story is being written. And in Judges chapter 2 and verse 7, this statement is made. So the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen the great works of the Lord which he had done for Israel. As you read the Old Testament, I challenge you to find a more successful generation of God's people than the generation of Joshua. You read the book of Joshua and you read a book of people who were devoted to and committed to serving the Lord, who were successful. It's a contrast from the generation before that didn't have enough faith to enter the land. And as we're going to see in a moment, it's a contrast in the generations that would follow. But why was Joshua's generation so successful? Was it because they had a king to rule over them and to say, hey, here's what you've got to do? No. Go back to Joshua chapter 24. Joshua chapter 24 and verse 1. Go back to Joshua chapter 24 and verse 1. 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 Jo We're familiar with verse 15. In Joshua 24 and verse 15, this is Joshua speaking to the people. He's concluding his speech, and he says, if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served, which are on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. But I want you to notice, if you go on and look at this ongoing conversation, what the people said. Verse 21. Verse 18, end of the verse. They talk about this. The Lord drove them out. We also will serve the Lord, for he is our God. Verse 21, and the people said to Joshua, no, but we will serve the Lord. Again in verse 24. And the people said to Joshua, the Lord our God we will serve, and his voice we will obey. Joshua challenged the people of his generation. He said, you've got a choice to make. It's your choice. Who do you serve? Joshua said, look, I've already made my choice. I'm going to serve God. And 3 times, as recorded, these people said, look, we also make that choice. We will serve the Lord. And without a king, without an earthly government to say, here's what you're going to do, they were successful and they served the Lord. Judges 2 verse 7 says, they served them all the days of that generation. But then, you have one of the most horrifying statements in the Bible, Judges 2 and verse 10. Another generation arose that did not know the Lord. Time came when a generation arose, whether it was the exact next generation, another generation after that, but there came a time when a generation arose that did not make that choice to serve the Lord, did not know the Lord. It doesn't mean they didn't know him in the sense of, hey, who is God? Who is he? It's a matter of knowing him in the sense of serving him and honoring him and doing his will. In verses 11 through 19, you have a cycle described that encapsulates everything that happens in the book of Judges. The people would serve God for a little bit. They'd fall into sin. God would send us suffering from other nations. And then when they would cry out, he would save them. But over and over, they continued to not choose to serve the Lord. They didn't make that choice. Then, interestingly, when you turn to the time of the kings, do you find that when the kings came along, suddenly the nation was righteous, and that suddenly everybody did what they were supposed to do, and suddenly everybody honored God and served him the way they should? On the contrary. With the exception of David and a few of the kings in Judah, most of the kings were actually a negative influence on the people. It's interesting that if you look in 1 Samuel chapter 13, the very first king that God set over these people, it doesn't take very long for him to depart from the instructions of God. 1 Samuel chapter 13, beginning in verse 8. Then he waited 7 days according to the time set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. So Saul said, bring a burnt offering and peace offerings here to me. And he offered the burnt offering. Now it happened as soon as he had finished presenting the burnt offering that Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him that he might greet him. And Samuel said, what have you done? Kings weren't supposed to offer sacrifices. Priests were supposed to offer sacrifices. Saul said, when I saw that the people were scattered from me, and you did not come within the days appointed, and the Philistines gathered together at Michmash, then I said, the Philistines will now come down on me at Gilgal. I have not made supplication to the Lord. Therefore I felt compelled and offered a burnt offering. Samuel said to Saul, you have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be commander over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. King was the one violating the will of God. Remember what we read in Deuteronomy 17? God said, you make sure he's got a book of the law. You make sure he knows it. You make sure he follows it. Why? He's to be the example. He's to be the one who leads the people in the way of serving the Lord. This king didn't. He set the example of, hey, when things get a little tough, I'll just make up my own rules and do it my own way. In chapter 15, story that would be the ultimate and final downfall of Saul, chapter 15 and verse 3. We're familiar with the story where he's given this instruction, chapter 15 and verse 3. Now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox, sheep, camel, and donkey. Now that's pretty straightforward, isn't it? I want to punish Amalek for how they treated my people. You go and you wipe them off of the face of the earth. Man, women, child, animal, I don't care. I want them all destroyed. Every one. In verse 9, but Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep, the oxen, the fatlings, the lambs, and all that was good, and were unwilling to utterly destroy them, but everything despised and worthless, that they utterly destroyed. And in verse 15, I want you to note Saul's response. I want you to think about how many times leaders use this as an excuse. Saul said, they have brought them. When Samuel said, why'd you bring this back? I gave you an instruction. Why didn't you do what I said? Look at what Saul says. They have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God, and the rest we have utterly destroyed. You know what Saul said? He said, look, it's the people's fault. It's what they wanted. It was their will. How many times in our society is leadership defined not by, I'm going to stand for what is true and what is right, but I'm going to do whatever the people want. I'm going to do what's popular. And that's exactly what Saul did. Instead of Saul saying something, saying, I'm the king, I have been given instruction by the prophet Samuel, and this is what we're going to do, he took some of it back, and then he blamed the people for his failures. We're familiar with 2 Kings chapter 11, or 1 Kings chapter 11, I'm sorry. 1 Kings chapter 11. The story of Solomon. Such a sad story. Solomon's story starts off so bright. God comes to him and says, what do you want? I'll give you whatever you want. He says, I want wisdom. I need help to govern these people. But its ending is so sad. Because he goes and he marries all these women and he introduces all of this idolatry into the land, which also ends up leading to the division of the nation. How sad. Was he a king who helped the people do what was right in the eyes of the Lord, who helped them honor and respect the law of God as they should have? No. No, he wasn't. And of course, we have just a couple of chapters later, the next chapter over, you have the story of Jeroboam. When Solomon dies and the kingdom is divided, Jeroboam is given the ruler as ruler over the northern kingdom. And what does Jeroboam do? For fear that the people will return to Jerusalem for worship, he sets up idols in Israel so they don't have to go Doesn't that sound a lot like what we read about in the book of Judges? We're going to set up some worship for convenience. We're going to do some things that make this easier, and we're going to try to save our people from wanting to rejoin back up with the southern kingdom. How did their king help them? So we say a king isn't the answer, and that God's intent was not for a king. So what was God's intent? What did God have in mind for the people? It's the same thing God has always desired, and that is spiritual leadership and individual responsibility. When you go back to the establishment of the law, and you go back to the book of Deuteronomy, what you find is it was the responsibility of the priests to teach the people. In Deuteronomy 31, and beginning in verse 9, Deuteronomy chapter 31 and beginning in verse 9. So Moses wrote this law and delivered it to the priests who bore, sons of Levi, who bore the ark of the covenant to the elders of the Israel. Moses commanded them, saying, at the end of every 7 years, at the appointed time, in the year of release, at the Feast of Tabernacles, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God in the place which he chooses, you shall read this law before all Israel in their hearing. Gather the people together, men and women and little ones, and the stranger who is within your gates, that they may hear and that they may learn to fear the Lord your God and carefully observe all the words of this law, and that their children who have not known it may hear and learn to fear the Lord your God as long as you live in the land which you cross the Jordan to possess. They had the responsibility of teaching the people the law. They didn't have, as we do today. I went and recently I lost the paper Bible that I had used for some years. I don't know what happened. I'm still not sure where it got misplaced. Within a matter of 3 days, I purchased 5 more Bibles. In part because I didn't want to lose another one, in part because I like the features of different ones. The point is, it's readily accessible. But guess what? Even during that time, I still had ready access to the Bible through my tablet, through my computer, through my phone. But you know, the people that day didn't have that. It was the responsibility of the priest to teach them the law. That's where the responsibility was laid. God didn't say, hey, look, I'm going to set up kings. I'm going to set up a government that has all the responsibility of setting up schools. And it was the responsibility of the spiritual leaders of the people to teach the people the law. I'm not going to take time to read Deuteronomy 17, 18 through 13, but basically if there were questions about the law and they needed it to be settled, they would go to the priest. If they weren't sure, say, well, I'm not sure what this means, and we've got this dispute going on. It was the priest that they would go to settle that. So God had put spiritual leadership in the nation, but there's another step to this. And this ties in really well with what we've been talking about in our Bible class, and that is God put a responsibility on parents. And we're going to take time to reread all of these verses. We've read many of these in our Bible class. If you haven't been coming to the Bible class, I strongly encourage you to do so. It's valuable for us to learn. In Exodus chapter 12, you have the establishment of the Passover. You know what one of the things God told them as he was establishing all these things? He said, look, when your children ask you about why do we do these things, you answer and you explain what the blood on the doorpost means. We were talking recently with Nicole about this particular passage, and she said, blood on the door, isn't that gross? An opportunity for teaching. Why? Why would they put blood on that doorpost? What did that mean to those people? Are we prepared? Were they prepared? I think of this passage and I think again of Judges 2 and 10. Another generation arose who did not know the Lord. Why? That was a responsibility given to the parents to instruct and to teach. Deuteronomy chapter 4 verses 8 through 10, a passage that we've referenced in our study. Similar to Deuteronomy chapter 6. And what great nation is there that has such statutes and righteous judgments are in this law, which I set Only take heed to yourself and diligently keep yourself, lest you forget the things your eyes have seen, and lest they depart from your heart all the days of your life. And teach them to your children and your grandchildren, especially concerning the day you stood before the Lord your God in Horeb, when the Lord said to me, gather the people to me, and I will let them hear my words, that they may learn to fear me all the days they live on the earth, and that they may teach their children. There's two parts of that, and we've discussed both of these in Bible class. Heed these things, live them, keep these things. It is your responsibility to remember what God has done, but not just to keep them and to remember them, but to pass them on to the next generation. I challenge anybody to find any passage that lays any burden on teaching children other than the parents. It is the parents' responsibility to teach their children about God. In chapter 6 of Deuteronomy, a passage we looked at, he talks about keeping this in your heart and teaching it to your children. Joshua chapter 4 is another one where they were crossing over the Jordan and they're setting up the stones as they cross, and he says, when your children ask, what do these stones mean? Do we talk to our children about why we partake of the Lord's Supper, why we can eat this bread here and they don't, but then they go home and eat crackers? What's the difference? Why can they sit down at breakfast and drink grape juice, but we don't give them grape juice when they're here in the assembly? What's the significance? What does it mean? Why do we come every Sunday? Why do we do the things that we do? Is it just because somebody's going to check us off the checklist in the back? Is it just because that's what we do? Because that's what we've always done? God's plan has always been for spiritual leadership and individual responsibility. I want you to look at throughout history the examples, with or without a king. You have Joseph and you have Joshua before the days of kings, and the days of the patriarchs for Joseph. And yet he chose to serve the Lord. He didn't do what was right in his own eyes. Why? Because he understood the responsibility he had to God. It was an individual choice to serve God. You have the prophets in the time when the kingdoms were wicked and were falling apart and were departing from God. You have the prophets who stood up and stood true and proclaimed the word of God because they understood the importance of the service to God. In the days of Elijah, when Elijah himself was discouraged, God said, there are 7,000. You have some of the most wicked kings in the northern kingdom, and yet there were 7,000 people who still had not bowed the knee to Baal. Individual choices to serve the Lord. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Daniel, all who were, their kingdom had fallen. Their kingdom no longer stood. Could they then say, well, that's okay, we can do whatever we want? No. They understood their individual responsibility to God. God has always expected the individual to have an understanding and accept the responsibility that they have. So what about for us today? As I was thinking how to kind of bring this home and kind of tie this together, I thought of several different things, but then this came to mind. John chapter 18. And the conversation that Jesus had with Pilate. Beginning in verse 33. Pilate answered, am I a Jew? Verse 33. Then Pilate entered the praetorium again, called Jesus and said to him, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus answered him, are you speaking for yourself about this? Or did others tell you this concerning me? Pilate answered, am I a Jew? Your own nation, the chief priests, have delivered you to me. What have you done? Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered. to the Jews, but now my kingdom is not from here." Pilate therefore said to him, "Are you a king then?" Jesus answered, "You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Guess what? We have a king today. The Jews in the book of Judges had a king. That king was God. God had set forth the way in which he would reign. They simply had rejected him. They had rejected his plan. They had chosen not to follow his rule. Guess what? We have a king today, Jesus. He's not an earthly king. He didn't come to establish an earthly kingdom. He never intended to establish an earthly kingdom. And he's not coming back to establish an earthly kingdom. You want to know how to be a citizen of this kingdom? Go read Matthew chapters 5 through 7. That's how you act like a citizen of this kingdom. That's how you serve Jesus. That's how you make him your king. You acknowledge him. You obey him. You're buried in the waters of baptism to enter that relationship, to enter his dominion, his rule. And then you live like he has instructed you. It doesn't matter whether we live in the United States in 1700s where people had a respect for the Bible, or whether we live here in 2022 where government has absolutely no respect for the Bible and for God, or whether we live here 100 years from now where maybe there's not even a democracy or a republic, if you want to be more accurate about the terminology. But the point is even if Christianity becomes oppressed in this country, the responsibility will still be on the individual to serve the king, whose kingdom is not of this world. Hebrews chapter 8 further says this. Hebrews chapter 8, beginning in verse 7. "For if that first covenant had been faultless, then no place would have been sought for a second. Because finding fault with them, he says, Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they did not continue in my covenant, and I disregarded them, says the Lord. For this is the covenant I will make with the house of the Lord after those days, says the Lord. I will put my laws in their mind. I will write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people." What does God expect of us today? God doesn't expect us to go somewhere and establish an earthly kingdom where the rulers and the leaders respect the laws of God. Because even if you do that, you know what's going to happen? Eventually they're going to deter from that. They're going to leave that. We probably had as close to that as any nation had when this nation was established 200 and something years ago. And what happened? Sin and Satan and people happened. But you know what? It doesn't matter. Because that's not where our responsibility lies. Our responsibility lies in the kingdom of which we are to be a citizen, the kingdom of heaven. Serving the King, being individually responsible to serve him, not dependent on some earthly government, to make sure that we do what is right in the eyes of God. And then as I thought, how do I bring this lesson to a close? How do I wrap all of this up? And I thought about this verse. In Judges, you have this mentality. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. I just do whatever I want. What does Paul say in Galatians 2 and verse 20? He says exactly the opposite. He says this, Galatians 2 and verse 20. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me, and the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Paul says, look, it's not about what I want. People and judges, I do whatever I want. I do what pleases me. I do what makes me happy. Does that sound a lot like our society today? Paul said, not me. I've died, and Christ lives in me. I let the will of Christ rule and run my life in the flesh. How many of us are willing to do that? We can be on either end of the spectrum. The one who says, I'll do whatever I please, I'll do what I want, I'll do what makes me happy. Or we can acknowledge that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. We can confess His name. We can repent of the life that we live of selfishness and self-service. And when we're buried in a relationship with Him, we can serve in His kingdom, and we can reap the benefits of letting Christ live in us. Think about that as together we stand and as we sing.